He was once the face of America's dream, the silent hero who made the world believe that honor still had a place in Hollywood. Kevin Costner, the protector in The Bodyguard, the dreamer in Field of Dreams, the fearless filmmaker behind Dances with Wolves, didn't just act in stories. He rewrote the way Hollywood tells them. From the dusty streets of Lynwood, California, the son of a ditch digger and a weary social worker, he rose not through privilege, but through faith, grit, and the sacred belief that truth still lives in ordinary people. He is not merely an actor. He is an architect of emotion, a man who carved meaning out of silence, turned loneliness into poetry, and built worlds where hope and heartbreak walk hand in hand. But behind that calm voice and proud gaze lies a heart battered by storms. 2 broken marriages, 7 children by 3 women, courtroom wars that turned love into loss, and the kind of emptiness that no applause could ever fill. The cheers could never drown out the silence that came after. The spotlight could never warm the cold of an empty home. And now, at 70, the storm has returned. Darker, heavier, and closer than ever. If Kevin Costner has ever touched your life through a role, a smile, or a quiet moment of strength, honor him with a like. Not for fame, not for pity, but as a silent salute to a man who has bled in silence, carried his cross through the fire of fame, and still chooses to shine like the last burning torch of Hollywood. The story of Kevin Costner doesn't begin with fame, it begins with silence. Long before the world saw him as a hero, he was a small boy in a house that trembled with both love and loss. His parents, Bill and Sharon Costner, lived a life measured not in wealth, but in willpower. His father came home each day with the scent of oil and dust clinging to his hands, the kind of hands that could fix anything but time. His mother, a social worker, carried the sorrow of strangers in her eyes, yet still found a way to hum as she cooked dinner on a flickering stove. Their world was small, but inside that narrow space, Kevin learned everything he would one day need to survive Hollywood discipline, endurance, and silence. 2 years before he was born, tragedy had already entered the Costner home. His brother, Mark Douglas, lived for just 1 day before his tiny heart stopped beating. No one ever spoke of it again, but the loss became an invisible wall between love and fear. Kevin grew up inside that quiet. It shaped him. His father became sterner, his mother softer, and the child between them learned to listen instead of speak. Sometimes late at night, Kevin would catch her staring at the corner of the room, her eyes distant, as though she still saw the child she never got to hold. His father's silence was his way of keeping the family from breaking. That unspoken grief would become Kevin's first lesson in storytelling, how pain hides between words, how the strongest feelings make no sound. By the time he turned 12, he had already moved more times than most children ever will. Compton, Ventura, Visalia, Orange County, always chasing stability that never lasted. Each time they packed, he learned the art of letting go of friends, of homes. He once said, "I learned early how to keep my world inside." The observer, the one who carries the weight so no one else has to. And in that whisper was a hunger, the need to build something that would finally last. The world didn't yet see him, but he was already watching it, taking mental notes, studying faces, memorizing how joy and pain looked when they thought no one was watching. In the choir at church, his voice quivered with longing. In his notebooks, he wrote about open fields, about homes that didn't move, about fathers who stayed. If the world wouldn't give him a place, he would build one. Every goodbye, every move, every quiet dinner at that worn-out table had been training not for fame, but for resilience. He would later say, "Life doesn't owe you comfort. It only offers you chances to begin again." That single sentence, born in the dust of his father's boots and the softness of his mother's prayers, would carry him through every storm to come. Because before Kevin Costner became the guardian of others, he was a boy learning how to survive himself. Dreams often begin quietly, disguised as something ordinary. For Kevin Costner, his began in the back seat of a car filled with cardboard boxes and half-packed memories. The Costner family moved so often that each town blurred into the next new schools, new faces, the same feeling of not quite belonging. Every time the family settled, life packed up again. His father's search for work became the rhythm of Kevin's childhood, and the sound of duct tape ripping across boxes became his lullaby. But from that instability came something extraordinary, an inner stillness. He learned that when the world around you keeps moving, The only thing that lasts is what you carry inside. While his older brother Dan thrived in sports and confidence, Kevin watched, quiet and observant, sketching people in his head like characters he might one day bring to life. His silence wasn't shyness, it was training. At night, he would write little verses, unfinished stories about fathers and lost towns. He dreamed of places where no one had to leave, wide fields, still air, the kind of permanence he'd never known. That yearning would later breathe through his characters. Men who build, protect, and never let go, no matter the cost. In high school, his teachers barely noticed him. He wasn't the loudest, or the smartest, or the star athlete, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a restraint that felt older than his years. When other students rehearsed lines for fun, he sat in the corner, watching how emotion lived on their faces. He wasn't yet an actor, but he was already learning to listen like one. He once said, "I wasn't trying to impress anyone, I was trying to feel something real." That need for truth over performance would later become the heartbeat of his art. After graduation, he did the right thing. College, business degree, stability. He enrolled at California State University, Fullerton, majoring in marketing and finance, the kind of path that looks safe, practical, predictable. He met Cindy Silva there, the gentle soul who would become his first wife, and for a while, it seemed that life was unfolding just as it should. But even as he smiled for yearbook photos and planned a future in finance, something inside him rebelled. He felt trapped behind the desk of a life he didn't choose. He once said, "In that sterile office, surrounded by fluorescent light and the drone of typewriters, the boy who once dreamed of open fields realized that comfort was its own kind of prison." Then fate, strange, cinematic, and perfectly timed, decided to intervene. It was 1978. Kevin had just married Cindy, and the couple were returning from their honeymoon in Mexico. Their flight was delayed, and seats were rearranged. Kevin sat down beside an older man whose voice sounded hauntingly familiar. When the man introduced himself, Kevin's heart nearly stopped. It was Richard Burton, the Shakespearean Titan, one of the greatest actors alive. For the entire flight, Kevin could barely speak. Finally, somewhere over the clouds, he confessed his secret dream. "I want to be an actor," he said softly, "but am afraid." Burton looked at him for a long moment, then smiled the kind of tired, knowing smile of someone who has already seen the price of ambition. "You have green eyes," Burton said. "I have green eyes. You'll be fine." When the plane landed, Burton's limousine pulled up to the tarmac. He leaned out the window, met Kevin's gaze one last time, and said two words that would change everything. "Good luck." It was not advice. It was a challenge. Within weeks, Kevin quit his job. He traded his pressed shirts for worn jeans, his desk for a battered Datsun, and drove toward Los Angeles with nothing but faith, $300, and a dream too fragile to explain. His parents thought he was reckless. Cindy worried quietly but never stopped believing. Hollywood was merciless. He scrubbed boats, delivered goods, and gave bus tours of celebrity homes describing mansions that didn't belong to him while wondering if anyone would ever tour his. Nights were colder than the paychecks. He didn't tell his family how hard it was. Pride wouldn't let him. His first break came in a low-budget film called Sizzle Beach, USA, shot under the burning California sun with no budget, no audience, and no future. When it was finally released years later, it embarrassed him. "I wished I could buy every copy and burn it," he said. He learned that talent opens the door, but persistence keeps it from closing. There were years of rejection, silence, and empty pockets. Casting directors barely looked up. He auditioned, disappeared, and started again. 6 years passed before anything changed. Then came the big chill. He landed a small part only to see all his scenes cut. It should have broken him. Instead, it lit the fire deeper. They just give you the strength to keep knocking. And in 1985, when director Lawrence Kasdan, the same man who had cut him, called about a new film called Silverado, Kevin Costner finally stepped into the light. The boy who had spent his life on the move had finally found a home on screen. By the time Silverado premiered in 1985, Kevin Costner was 30 years old, still young enough to be called a newcomer, but hardened by every rejection the town could throw at him. The role wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. His energy filled the screen like something raw and uncontainable, that restless spirit of a man who had waited too long to be seen. The audience didn't just watch him, they felt him. A star wasn't born that night. He was released. Within months, Hollywood's doors, once sealed shut, began to creak open. Producers who had ignored his headshots now called his name. Directors who couldn't remember his face suddenly remembered every word he had said. But Kevin didn't walk through those doors with arrogance. He walked in with purpose. For him, every role wasn't about fame. It was survival. 2 years later, he would become the face of moral conviction in The Untouchables. As Elliot Ness, he wasn't the loudest man in the room, he was the still point in chaos. A lawman guided by principle, courage, and the kind of quiet power that Costner had been rehearsing his whole life. The film grossed over $100 million, but what it gave him was something more permanent: credibility. Critics called him the new archetype of the American hero. He didn't act toughness, he embodied it. You could see his father's calloused hands in every gesture, his mother's compassion in every pause. That duality, grit and grace, became his signature. And then came 1,988 seconds, Bull Durham, followed by 1,989 seconds, Field of Dreams. Two roles that redefined what it meant to be a leading man in the 1,980 seconds. He wasn't the perfect hero or the untouchable god. He was flawed, quiet, human. In Bull Durham, he made vulnerability look masculine. In Field of Dreams, he made faith look possible. When he stood in that golden cornfield whispering, "If you build it, he will come," audiences didn't just hear a line, they heard their own secret hopes. That scene would become one of the most immortal moments in film history. And behind it stood a man who had spent his life building something invisible: belief. So he did the unthinkable. He mortgaged his house, risked his fortune, and formed TIG Productions to create a film that Hollywood called madness. A 3-hour Western told partly in the Lakota language. They said no one would watch it. No one cared about cowboys anymore. But Kevin believed silence could speak louder than spectacle. He believed that the forgotten voices of history deserved their own stage. So he directed Dances with Wolves. The production was chaos, storms wrecked, sets, budgets spiraled out of control. Actors quit. Kevin spent nights in a freezing trailer, doubting everything. There were days when he thought head ruined his career, when investors stopped returning calls, when even his crew began to whisper that it would never work. But still, he kept filming. And when the movie premiered, the impossible happened. Dances with Wolves didn't just succeed, it transcended. It earned over $424 million worldwide, won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, and cemented Kevin Costner as one of the defining storytellers of his generation. Yet the moment the applause began, he felt something strange. Silence. "I didn't trust myself," he admitted later. "The more they called me a genius, the lonelier I felt." The price of triumph is often isolation. And for Kevin Costner, that lesson was only beginning. The early 90 seconds became a storm of fame and fatigue. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, broke box office records but drew harsh criticism for his accent. Then came JFK with Oliver Stone, where he faced political controversy that would have destroyed a weaker man. "Any discussion of what might be true," he said, "only makes us freer." Then, in 1992, he waited an entire year for Whitney Houston to say yes to The Bodyguard. He turned down $10 million to take a gamble on her, believing she was the one. He became not just her co-star, but her protector on and off screen. The movie became a global phenomenon. It earned $411 million. The soundtrack sold over 50 million copies. And yet, behind the smiles and tuxedos, he began to feel something missing. "Success can be lonelier than failure," he once said. "When everyone tells you you're right, you start to wonder if you still are." But he had no idea that the same empire he built would soon turn on him, and that the next fall would nearly destroy everything he had fought for. By 1993, Kevin Costner stood at the summit of Hollywood, an empire built not from privilege but persistence. His face was everywhere: magazine covers, red carpets, billboards blazing his name in gold. He was the man every studio wanted and every actor envied, yet every night, when the lights went out, he sat alone in hotel rooms, too quiet to feel alive. He had everything the world could offer: wealth, awards, fame, but no peace. He confessed to a friend, "I was surrounded by people, yet it never felt more alone." Between Robin Hood, JFK, and The Bodyguard, He had become the embodiment of the American myth, the honorable man standing between chaos and order. But playing the hero on screen was easier than being one in life. The long absences from home were taking a toll. Cindy, his college sweetheart, was raising their 3 children alone in Ventura while tabloids filled with rumors, whispers of Costner's, late nights on set, of distance measured not in miles but in years. He tried to fix it, family vacations, pauses between films, promises whispered at kitchen tables. But fame is greedy. It devours everything, time, privacy, tenderness, until all that's left is the image. At the 1,991 Oscars, he stood beneath the golden lights, clutching 2 Academy Awards for Dances with Wolves. His name echoed through the room. Back home, Cindy watched on television, 3 children asleep beside her, a world away. He said later, "That night, I realized success doesn't hold your hand when you go home." As the years passed, the cracks deepened. By 1994, the marriage that had carried him from poverty to stardom finally broke. The divorce was brutal, one of the costliest in Hollywood history. No prenup, no safety net, just heartbreak and lawyers. Cindy walked away with $80 million, and Kevin was left with the quiet kind of loss that doesn't end when the papers are signed. He said, "The hardest part wasn't losing the money. It was losing the laughter of my kids under one roof." The press feasted on the story America's hero falls from grace, but behind the headlines was something no one saw, a man who didn't know how to be ordinary anymore. He buried himself in scripts, in sets, in motion. Then came 1,995 Seconds, Waterworld, the film that should have been his next triumph. Instead, it nearly drowned him, literally. Hurricanes destroyed the sets, budgets exploded, and at one point, he almost died while tied to a mast during filming. The movie cost $235 million, the most expensive production of its time, and became Hollywood's favorite punchline. The tabloids called it Kevin's Gate. The film's failure shattered his invincible image, but instead of retreating, he doubled down. The Postman, 1,997, another passion project, written, directed, and starred by him. He poured his soul into it, but the critics tore it apart. It swept the Razzies Worst Picture, Worst Actor, Worst Director. The same hands that once held Oscars now held ridicule. He didn't fight back. He didn't explain. He simply went quiet. In an interview years later, he said softly, "You can't answer every lie. You just outlive them." Hollywood moved on, new stars, new trends, new faces. The man who once ruled the box office was suddenly labeled outdated. Studios lost interest. And yet, he didn't crumble. Because Kevin Costner wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing meaning. He retreated to his ranch in Aspen, surrounded by silence and the mountains. There, he found what the city had taken stillness. He wrote, he read, he rode horses with his children on weekends. Out of that quiet came Open Range, 2003, a Western stripped of spectacle, built on heart and honor. It made $68 million, modest, but enough to remind the world that he was still standing. He said, "The truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs time." That film marked his rebirth not as the untouchable hero, but as the weathered man who had learned humility. And then, years later, came Yellowstone. At 63, when most actors fade into nostalgia, Kevin Costner roared back to life as John Dutton, a patriarch scarred by loss, hardened by time, and devoted to land and family above all else. It wasn't just a role. It was him. Every line carried the weight of everything he had lived. "I don't play heroes," he said. "I play men who try." The series exploded into a phenomenon, the most-watched cable drama in America, drawing over 16 million viewers. He earned $1.3 million per episode, but the money meant nothing. For the first time in decades, he was telling stories about legacy, not fame. The boy from Lynwood had come full circle. He was no longer chasing the light. He was building it. But destiny wasn't finished testing him. Because just as he was rebuilding his world, love, family, peace, life would hand him one final storm. A heartbreak darker than any script he had ever written. It began with quiet, the kind of silence that creeps into a home long before anyone dares to name it. Kevin Costner thought the worst storms were behind him, that after decades of rebuilding, life had finally granted him peace. The ranch in Aspen glowed with laughter again. The dinner table full, the air steady. For nearly 2 decades, his marriage to Christine Baumgartner had seemed like the reward for all the years of loss, love born not of youth's recklessness, but of hard-earned faith. They met in 1998. She was 20 years younger, graceful, confident, grounded. A model and designer with calm steadiness that balanced the restless fire in him. They drifted apart once in 2002 when she wanted children, and he feared beginning again. But time, persistent as gravity, pulled them back. I couldn't lose her over that, he said later. Their wedding in 2004 was something out of a fairy tale. At his beloved Dunbar Ranch in Aspen, white tents glowed under the mountain sun, horses grazed in the distance, and Christine arrived in a horse-drawn carriage. Kevin waited beneath a canopy of light, tears in his eyes. I didn't think he'd get this chance again, he whispered to a friend. For 19 years, they built what looked like paradise. 3 children, Caden, Hayes, and Grace, turned the sprawling ranch into a living dream. Winters of snow forts, summers of lake swims, movie nights by the fireplace. Kevin often said, This is what I was running toward all along. But paradise rarely burns. It erodes. It begins with missed breakfasts, unreturned glances, the quiet closing of bedroom doors. By the early 2022s, work crept back into the spaces where love once lived. Yellowstone consumed his schedule. Horizon, his new frontier epic, devoured everything else: time, money. I miss the simple things, she told a friend. Coffee, breakfast, a day with no schedule. She still set the table for 5, even on nights he didn't make it home. And Kevin, chasing his dream, never noticed the chairs staying empty. Then came the thunderclap. May 2023. Kevin was on set in Utah, directing Horizon, when a production assistant handed him an envelope. The words inside ended 19 years of love. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Irreconcilable differences. He stood there, motionless, under the burning desert sun, the pages trembling in his hand. It felt like the ground came out from under me, he confided to a friend. What followed wasn't the quiet parting of 2 tired hearts. It was a public war. Lawyers, headlines, court filings dissected like autopsies. The numbers filled newspapers, but none of them spoke of what truly mattered: 3 children, caught between 2 homes, and a silence that would never be the same again. Christine requested $248,000 a month in child support. The court reduced it to $63,000, but money couldn't measure the ache of absence. Their prenuptial agreement, ironclad, unyielding, forced her to leave their Santa Barbara home, the place where their children had taken first steps, first swims, first words. Neighbors said the day she left, the curtains fluttered like wings. That night, Kevin returned to rooms that still smelled faintly of her perfume and the ocean. He stood at the kitchen door, staring into the dark. For the first time in years, he realized silence has a scent. Then came the betrayal. No script could soften photographs of Christine walking along the coast beside Josh Connor, a man Kevin had once called a friend. They had shared dinners, trust, laughter. Now their images filled the tabloids. Proof of nothing. Pain of everything. I still love her, Kevin told a confidant, but some things you can't unsee. For the second time in his life, he found himself dividing a world he had built by hand. But this time, it wasn't money that was halved. It was the laughter of his children. By early 2024, the court declared the marriage over. The prenup held. The love didn't, he said quietly. The first time, I lost half my wealth. This time, I lost half my heart. He finished filming Horizon through tears and exhaustion. On set, crew members said he rarely spoke between takes. The man who once played the bodyguard now needed one not for safety, but for solitude. When the day ended, he would sit alone in his trailer, reading his lines in a voice just above a whisper. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, eyes fixed on nothing, the desert wind rattling the walls around him. It was a different kind of heartbreak, not explosive, not loud, just slow and total, the kind that dissolves your sense of home. Outside, the cameras rolled. Inside, a legend was falling apart quietly, unseen. In one of his notebooks, found later on set, a line was scrawled between sketches of shots and lighting notes. Some losses don't destroy you. They reveal what's left when everything else is gone. And that is where Kevin Costner now stands among the ruins of love, holding the fragments of faith, still trying. The storm passed, but it didn't leave peace, only clarity. When the courts fell silent and the headlines moved on, Kevin Costner was left with the quiet he had spent a lifetime both chasing and fearing. Aspen's cold mornings felt heavier, the laughter of children now echoing through phone calls instead of hallways. But in that stillness, something unexpected began to grow again: acceptance. He never blamed Christine, not publicly, not privately. He said only, "Love doesn't always end because it dies. Sometimes it ends because it changes shape." He devoted himself to what had never failed him: work. At dawn, he still rose before the sun touched the Rockies, walking the ranch paths his children had once run through. He fed the horses himself, their breath steaming in the frost. To anyone watching, he looked like a man rehearsing for a scene. But this wasn't performance, it was ritual. The act of staying alive by doing something simple, real, and quiet. His hands ached, his knees stiffened, but he kept moving. The body reminds you of every stunt you've ever done, he joked softly, but it also reminds you that you're still here. At 70, Kevin Costner no longer measures life in premieres or paychecks. He measures it in mornings, in the rhythm of his boots on the dirt, in the way light lands on the mountains. Sometimes, his younger children, Caden, Hayes, and Grace, visit the ranch for weekends. They ride horses, build snow forts, and watch old home movies in his private screening room. Every good story, he tells them, is really about learning to forgive yourself. Annie runs a production company called Fierce Studios. Lily sings in quiet bars with the same melancholy that runs in her father's voice. Joe works behind the camera, shaping light the way Kevin once shaped truth. And then there's Liam, his son from a brief, quiet chapter with Bridget Rooney, a private soul who reminds him that not every gift arrives neatly wrapped. Kevin calls him my reminder that grace doesn't need to be perfect to be real. Despite the years, he remains a father first, a filmmaker second. Every birthday, every milestone, he shows up, maybe not in headlines, but in presence. Just being there. When asked in a recent interview about the hardest part of aging, he smiled gently. "It's not the pain," he said. "It's watching time move faster than love can keep up." But even as age presses on, he refuses to slow down. Horizon, an American saga, the project he risked everything for, has become more than a film. It's his confession, his testament. He poured $38 million of his own money into it, mortgaging properties, betting on faith one last time. Critics call it stubborn. He calls it unfinished business. "People think I'm trying to make another hit," he said. "I'm trying to finish a promise." When Horizon premiered in 2024, reviews were divided, but Kevin stood tall. He smiled as the credits rolled, not the smile of victory, but of peace. Because for him, the success was not in numbers, but in completion. Watching the final frame flicker across the screen, a cowboy in silhouette, walking toward a dying sun. And in that image, he saw himself older, slower, but unbroken. He whispered to no one in particular. Kevin Costner no longer needed to prove anything, not to Hollywood, not to his critics, not even to himself. He had already lived every act of the story: the rise, the fall, the redemption. What remained was reflection. They fade into symbols, and symbols live longer than truth. Kevin Costner has become one of those symbols, the quiet endurance of the American spirit. In a world addicted to noise, he reminds us that greatness doesn't need to shout, it just needs to last. His legacy is not only in the films he made, but in the way they felt. He gave Hollywood its heart back when cynicism had drained it dry. In Field of Dreams, he turned faith into something cinematic, a whisper in the corn that still echoes across generations. In Dances with Wolves, he gave dignity to the forgotten and silence to those history had erased. In The Bodyguard, he taught the world that protection isn't strength, it's love disguised as duty. Critics once called him stoic, but what they missed was the poetry beneath the stillness. His characters never screamed. They endured. And endurance, as time has proven, is the purest form of rebellion. Today, younger filmmakers cite him as a compass, a reminder that storytelling should never serve ego, only emotion. Yellowstone revived an entire genre because it understood what he's always known, that America's truest myths aren't about guns or glory, but land, legacy, and loss. In a recent interview, a young actor said, Siang Lu, consumes of a pine with things of a world. Keta said from quality and given in by 3-2. And when Siang world. And watching Costner act is like watching someone remember something painful in real time. That's his gift, the ability to turn memory into cinema, to make us feel nostalgia for lives we've never lived. Even his failures, Waterworld, The Postman, those bruised dreams have aged into something noble. In hindsight, they read less like missteps and more like experiments in courage. He was always chasing sincerity, even when the world demanded spectacle. And now, at 70, as others slow down, his horizon, an American saga, is no longer just a film, it's his living monument. Measure him by how many times he stands back up. Standing back up, that's his true legacy. Through betrayal, financial collapse, ridicule, and heartbreak, he never walked away from his craft or his conscience. He just kept showing up. Hollywood changes its gods every decade, but it has never replaced Kevin Costner. Because he doesn't belong to trends, he belongs to time. His films are stitched into the fabric of American nostalgia. The way the sun hits the horizon, the sound of a father's voice calling across a field, the silence that follows forgiveness. He is not remembered for the explosions, but for the pauses, for the moments when words failed and truth still found a way to breathe. And perhaps that's why his influence will outlive the box office, outlive the gossip columns, outlive the industry itself. Because the man who once rose from nothing to everything, who lost and rebuilt and forgave, has become something more powerful than a celebrity. He has become a myth of mercy, a living reminder that even when the world stops clapping, the work endures, and that sometimes silence is the loudest legacy of all. There's something deeply human about Kevin Costner's story, something that mirrors the quiet ache in all of us. He is proof that fame doesn't save you, and failure doesn't define you. Life is neither rise nor fall, it's rhythm. And Costner has lived every note of it. At Celebrity Forgotten, we've told hundreds of stories about stars who burned bright, faded fast, or vanished into mystery. But Kevin's tale isn't about vanishing. It's about enduring. His journey carries that rare weight, the kind that teaches, not preaches. The boy who once wrote poems in silence grew into a man who turned that silence into cinema. He is a paradox of Hollywood, powerful but humble, distant but intimate, broken but unbowed. Has made mistakes, has been reckless, has chased dreams too far and loved people too deeply. But he never lied about any of it. That honesty is what makes his life both painful and sacred. It's easy to idolize his victories, The Bodyguard, Dances with Wolves, Yellowstone. But what deserves reverence are the fractures, the way he kept going when his reputation fell apart, the way he faced humiliation, not with denial, but dignity. He once said, "That might be the most American thing about him, not the cowboy hats, not the open fields, but the courage to start over." We can debate his choices, the divorces, the stubborn independence, the financial risks that made headlines, but we can't deny the integrity of a man who keeps chasing truth even when it costs him everything. That's what separates actors from artists. Kevin Costner reminds us that stories worth telling aren't clean. They're messy, scarred, complicated, just like the people who live them. He built worlds that outlasted their applause. He showed that love can survive its ending, and legacy can rise from its ashes. Maybe that's the truest lesson he leaves behind, that there's grace in persistence, beauty in imperfection, and redemption in simply staying. Because even now, after decades of storms, the man still rides toward the horizon. Tired, perhaps, but unbroken. There's a certain sadness in realizing that time, like film, always keeps rolling, no matter who we are or how beautiful the frame once was. Kevin Costner stands now where few ever do, at the edge of legacy, where memory meets myth. The applause has quieted, the lights have dimmed, but somewhere in that silence, a man keeps walking toward his own horizon. He was never chasing immortality, he was chasing meaning. And perhaps that's why his story lingers, because it isn't perfect. It's painfully, beautifully human. He's the last echo of a Hollywood that once believed in soul over spectacle, story over fame. The cowboy who refused to stop believing in decency, even when the world around him forgot what that looked like. If you listen closely, you can still hear him in the distance. That soft, steady voice that carried us through Field of Dreams, through The Bodyguard, through Yellowstone. It's the voice of a man who never surrendered to bitterness, who turned loss into legacy and silence into song. And maybe that's why Kevin Costner will never really fade. Because his greatest performance was never on screen, it was in the way he lived, fell, broke, and still rose again with grace. In an industry built on illusions, he gave us something real. He reminded us that heroes don't always save the world. Sometimes they just refuse to give up on it. And so, as the curtain closes and the credits begin to roll, we're left with a feeling both heavy and hopeful. The quiet ache of having witnessed a life fully lived. Because some stories were never meant to be perfect, they were meant to feel. And this one, the story of Kevin Costner, will always feel like the sound of the wind over open plains, lonely,